We're now going to continue creating our fractured sharp base rock. And what we're going to do is bring in another fractal noise to add more variation that works similarly to the current setup. So going into the function, what we can do is use the existing 2D square sample fractal that's still in the function and remove that from the rotation and twist vector manipulator, and that math node, select it, and then select the link. And what we're going to do is create another rotation and twist. I'm going to reset the values to 0. And then if we go over to the blender on the bottom, we can switch this over to take a look at input 0, or what we have on the left. So what we're going to do is switch this over to the square patterns and choose squares. And we just need to modify the rotation in order to get this to work correctly. So go to the rotation and twist, and we're going to set the X to 45, and we'll set the Y to 35, and the Z to 45. And then we're going to just kind of twist it 2, and then -2, and then 3, and then turn on with rotation within the function itself, or within the node, the fractal node. So this is another type of fractured rock that we can use. And I will show just what it looks like when it's rendered. Just a very small part of it. So you can see that parts of it are similar to the other noise, but there is a lot more detail in certain areas that looks better. But we get more control and more defined shapes with the other noise, so I like to use these two together. So we're just going to go back into the function, and if you want, you can change the size, metascale largest feature, to be a little bit different. But let's take a look first at how they're going to blend together. We could just do a direct blend overlay. We could add them together. We could also use a subtraction or a multiply. Now, if we're going to do that, we need to make sure that we don't have any part of the noise inverting, which is going to happen if anything falls below 0. So if we take a look at the node preview and the link, obviously both of them are going well below 0. So that will start to invert it if we multiply or subtract. So we do need to offset it, or even set up an opposite if we were to subtract. So let's go ahead and set this to multiply. And I'm going to use and go ahead and switch input 1 and 0. So let's just go ahead and move over that new fractal to the other side and rework the blender input. So 0 is connected to the square samples, and input 1 is the square pattern. And we're going to select the link between the squares and the blender, add in a filter, and what we want to do is offset this. So we'll set the offset, and we just need to make sure it goes above 0, so nothing falls below 0, because they'll start to invert. We might be able to have a little bit of it go under, but it should be okay for the most part. What we can also do, might work a little bit better, is to invert or use an opposite. So we'll go to the filter, add another filter in that link, and select the opposite, which basically inverts it. And taking a look at our offset, making sure nothing's really going well below 0. And then the intensity of the multiplication is going to be the output amount, or the highest number. In the function node preview, there is the ability to have the automatic extension turned on, and that will tell you the highest range. That works both negative and positive. So even if it's going negative, say 7, it will show 7 as being the highest extension. So right now, we're multiplying it by 7.73. So if we need to reduce that, we can set up a map filter, which will work pretty well. If we take a look at the range of our other fractal, it goes well below 0, and it doesn't have as high of an output. So let's just go ahead and add in a map filter just below that offset. And if we go back just one step and take a look, what we're going to do is choose from 0 up to, let's say, 7.8. So 0 is our low value, 7.8 is our high value. And then how much do we want to multiply it by? So then we set our lower value to 0 because we don't want to fall below 0. We don't need to clip anything out because it's mapped correctly. And then we can just set our output amount, basically how much we want to multiply. We can go higher, we can go lower. I'm just going to go ahead and set it to 3. And then go into the output. And we're going to map this to -1 to 1, so that when we mix it further, it'll be easier to work with, or at least have the map set up. So select the map and the link, add a filter. And I do want to note that if you go to the upper left here, I do have automatically map connected parameters turned off. That is unchecked. And manual control of the mapping of the links works best. In this situation, the automatically mapped parameters are kind of hit or miss with certain features. It really depends. Sometimes when you're trying to control a vector with a number, it doesn't work correctly. So I usually just keep that feature turned off, which is new to View 9. So if you take a look at our output, 0 to -16. So our lower value is -16. 0 is our upper value. And let's go ahead and set the lower and upper to -1 to 1. And as long as that extension doesn't go above 1, you're within the range. 1 is going to be the max extension. It won't show you anything below +1 or -1. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And then we'll be able to start working this in with the terrain fractal. But first, let's just take a look at the rock. We might want to make some adjustments because we don't really have any separation between the larger features of rock right now. But we can customize that and fine-tune it later. Let's just take a look and see what we have so far. If we take a look, the roughness of the new fractal is somewhat overpowering the structure too much of the previous node and the square samples. So we might modify that a little bit more and kind of fine-tune it. For the most part, our shaping isn't going to come from this main fractal or this setup right here. This is our base that we're going to use. So what I want to do now is mix this together with the terrain fractal. And keep in mind too, we can also set our turbulence. And go ahead and take that new simple fractal we added, go to the origin output on the right, of the fractal, and you will need to have show parameter connections turned on in order to see those. If only one is showing, you can just move the node up and down, and they will show back up. So now we can set our turbulence to be equal for both of them, and our structure should remain a little bit better. Okay, so we're going to take this map filter and bring it up and give ourselves a little bit of room, add in a new fractal, which we want to connect to a multiply by a constant. So we're going to select that math node, add it in. Also the vector seed, I want to create a duplicate of that. We could also select both of those and copy and paste. But basically I want to be able to modify the terrain shape independently of the underlying rock. So if we were to randomize the material or randomize the function and change the seed, we can work independently of each other. So let's go ahead and change this over to the terrain fractal. And what we're going to do is connect from the map to the altitude output of the terrain fractal. And let's just take a look at this. We'll set it to billows, reduce the distortion a bit, increase that bump surge. And I'm going to go ahead and increase my wavelength a little higher. And set my multiply by constant. It's set at 128 by default, which is, I think, can be difficult to work with sometimes for smaller terrains. So let's go ahead and bring it down to 64 for now. So what we're going to use the underlying rock for to control is the smooth area altitude. If we take a look at the smooth area and just the manual control, it goes from -1 to 1. And you can see the change. It is related or directly connected basically to the bump surge and the gain are going to play a big role in that. So we're going to extract the smooth area altitude, connect it to our underlying rock. And we may need to reverse the function. So if we go to that map node, we're going to take our lower value, set it to 1, and our upper and set it to -1, and that'll reverse. So we could also fine-tune this and kind of choose which areas we want to show within that range. And now we can adjust the gain in order to see how many rocks are coming through. The terrain fractal is going to give us the ability to basically shape the actual terrain, but still get some of those underlying rocks. Now I am going to need to reset the scale of the terrain in order to get the function to show up better, because it is relative to the actual z-scale output. So right now it's pretty much flat because I reduced with the map filter our output before. So just using the scale gizmos, size that up a bit. F4 on the keyboard, or go to Atmosphere Editor. I am going to just modify the sun a little bit. So we can start to see the roughness and the features of the terrain fractal showing, and now with protruding rocks from the underlying rock layer. So this should give us a really nice looking terrain, and then we can go in and kind of tweak and fine-tune things if we feel that certain features need to be defined more or less. We'll go ahead and take a look at a render. And I'm really just going to stop the render where it's at right now, because for the most part the features of the terrain are being way too overpowered by the underlying rock. So I do want to set up and make a few changes to the terrain fractal in order to really pull out and vary the features a little bit more. If we go ahead and switch this over to the ridge mode, we might get a little more control. Also, changing the smooth area. And then modifying the metascale and largest feature of the terrain. And if you need to disconnect and look at the terrain by itself, you can just remove that link. Sometimes that helps. We might need to increase that bump surge, so let's extract the smooth area altitude again and reconnect it. And then we should be able to fine-tune this a little bit more. And really just kind of pull out just some of the main features of the rock. Rather than them being as dominant as they are. So that should work a little bit better right there. So the bump surge is really going to help separate between the terrain fractal and then just the peaks or the underlying rock layer that we want. And then from there we can use the gain in order to increase the underlying rock. So turning down the gain, really only see a small amount of the smooth area altitude. The terrain filter, or the terrain fractal, works differently with gain than other fractals, where 0 to 1 really controls what we're seeing right now is the noise variation and the settings that are listed under other, mainly the bump surge, and different details there. And then anything basically above 1 to 10 is what's going to act more like a normal fractal, where we're going to go beyond the fine-tuning range and into the overall output. At least for the most part. So if you need this to work like a regular gain, you can just multiply the output. So add a multiply filter if needed. And we set up a bit of distortion. And let's go ahead and click OK. Actually, I will go back really quick and change that smooth area amount. And then we'll try that out. That should work pretty well. Now, if the terrain itself is going too far above the pivot location, that's because your output's too high. And right now, it's basically, we have going from 0 to 1, rather than -1 to 1, which will give us a better amount of control. So what we can do is just map it, lower value 0 to 1, output range -1 to 1. And we should be able to work with this a little easier now. By doing that, I've basically doubled the output. So now we just need to scale it back down. So we'll probably need to change the overall shape of the terrain, because right now we just have a very small section relative to the protruding rocks and the underlying layer. But what we can do with those multiply math nodes up at the top of each vector is manipulate the scale. If you want to scale down the features, you increase that multiply number, and we can do that independently for both the terrain and the rocks and the underlying rock. So now we can see a bit better the shape of the terrain itself, with those nice rocks coming out of the sides. Probably would modify this a bit more. What we can try is switching back to the billows mode and seeing if we can get a better shape that way. Also going into the output range of the underlying rock and modifying just the altitude that way. And that way we can kind of clip things out. We could clip the out of range value for the input, so we could just cut out specific areas as well. And that'll give us a nice fracture in different spots. So that looks a little bit better. A lot more variation. So we've got these nice flat areas with the rock underneath it kind of being cut out. So at this point you've got a really good starting terrain to be able to just modify the settings of the different fractals and see what you can come up with. They're mixed together pretty well for the most part. I mean, you can obviously change the different settings if you don't want to take the original two fractals we designed, and if you don't want to multiply them, you want to try something else, or reduce the multiplication, maybe remove one, just use one or the other. A lot of different ways you can set this up and really get some interesting looking results. I've gone ahead and loaded in another scene I've created to show another example of what can be done with this sort of a setup. And this one, I was able to spend more time kind of fine-tuning it and pulling out the individual rocks. And I'm going to go ahead and include with the training, so you'll find within the content, in the project content, several scenes called square rock, and then underscore with a sequence number after it. So you can take a look at these scenes, and the setup is basically the same for the most part as what we just took a look at. There might be small differences here or there, but it'll give you a better idea of how you can control and customize these different terrains using this setup, because you can get, as you can see, some really nice looking terrains this way, and nice rocks without having to use any sort of displacement mapping or anything. So I thought this terrain was just really interesting, where we've got the separations between the different rocks sticking out, and the nice separations between the fractals. And if we take a look at the setup, you can see it, for the most part it's basically the same. There are a few differences, and basically I've taken the squares with square samples, multiplied only by half rather than the full amount, and you can see the output is a little different. And then I've gone ahead and multiplied that by a grainy fractal to add even more detail in some of those lines around the edge. So also the scales are set up a little bit different, and some of the other settings have changed. So you can go ahead and play around with these and see what we can come up with. There's no materials included for them. They haven't been set up that far, but it does give you a good base for at least the geometry. So a couple of those will be included along with scenes from the training.